You know how at the beginning of a disaster movie, there's always a scientist who's running around warning everyone that something bad is going to happen unless they do X, Y, and Z to stop it? Yeah, that's me in real life. I'm a disasterologist, which means I study disasters. All of the things that can go wrong, all of the things that will go wrong, and what we need to do right now to make sure that does not happen. The first time I saw the fallout of a catastrophe was in the lower Ninth Ward. It had been many months since Hurricane Katrina and the levee failure, but all around us, everything was broken. 80% of the city of New Orleans had flooded. In the lower Ninth Ward, a historic Black neighborhood, there had been over 10 feet of water. Thousands of residents had to be rescued from their roofs. For miles in every direction, houses lay in pieces, businesses sat empty, flooded cars were abandoned. There was no mail service, no public transportation, no street signs. People were dead, missing, injured, and taking temporary refuge all across the country. On street corners, there were these mountainous piles of debris sitting out, rotting in the southern heat. The smell was so strong that it sunk into our skin. Particles of dirt and who knows what else filled the air, and it clung to our sweat, leaving us covered in a layer of grime. Around us, the streets filled with a symphony of buildings collapsing, hammers pounding, and saws buzzing. I was down in New Orleans from Maine with a group of my high school classmates. We were just there to lend a hand over our spring break, helping get people back in their homes. I realized pretty quickly, though, that 1 week wasn't going to be enough. I decided that I would move to New Orleans to help with the recovery in the long term. For the next 4 years, I worked alongside the nonprofits and the New Orleanians who were rebuilding the city. I didn't realize this then, but my time in New Orleans would turn out to be an immersion into America's unjust emergency management system. What you have to understand is that although the entire city was affected by the flooding, not everyone was affected in the same way and to the same extent. The damages in New Orleans fell along the lines of race, class, gender, and ability. A long history of racist land use and housing policies meant that people of color tended to live in the areas most vulnerable to the flooding. For many of the people who didn't evacuate during the storm, it wasn't because they wanted to stay, but because they could not leave. They didn't have a car, they had a disability, they didn't have money to pay for gas or a hotel room. Of the over 1,000 people who died in the flood, a disproportionate number were elderly. It wasn't only that there were these disparities in the actual impacts, but I also began to notice that not everyone was recovering at the same rate. There were some parts of the city, mostly the whiter, wealthier areas, that were rebuilt within a couple of years. But then you'd go across town to neighborhoods like the lower Ninth Ward, and you would find homes still boarded up 15 plus years later. While I was doing this work, I thought that the problems I was seeing, the slowness of the rebuilding, the unevenness of the recovery, I thought that these were problems unique to New Orleans. I thought that it was this complicated history of this city and the particular politicians involved that was leading the recovery to unfold in this way. I could not fathom that this was how we had decided we were going to rebuild communities after disaster all across America. But then, I spent time down on the Louisiana coast during the BP oil disaster, and I went up to Missouri following the Joplin tornado, and to my surprise, those communities were dealing with the exact same kinds of recovery problems that we had been dealing with in New Orleans. That was when I realized, the problem in New Orleans was not that the recovery system was failing. It was that the recovery system was working exactly as it had been designed. It turns out that the US government intentionally limits how much help they give individuals after a disaster. They expect us to fund our own recoveries through savings accounts and insurance payouts, and when we fall short, as many people do or would, they expect nonprofits to swoop on in to do the rest. This approach, it doesn't account for people living in poverty, people living paycheck to paycheck, people who don't have access to programs like flood insurance, who, incidentally, are the exact same people who tend to be most affected when disasters happen. In New Orleans, this approach meant that the weight of rebuilding entire neighborhoods fell on the shoulders of nonprofit organizations who were working out of offices which themselves had not yet been rebuilt. I started to learn more about our emergency management system, the policies and the programs and the people and the organizations that help communities before, during, and after disasters. Y'all, the list of problems with this system, it's long, it's complicated, but the biggest dark cloud, the one that hangs over all of this and which makes solving the problems in our emergency management system fundamental to our very survival, is the climate crisis. There are two distinct but interrelated problems when it comes to climate change. The first is that we have to stop the climate from changing. This means immediately and completely limiting global carbon emissions. Now, you may have heard we're not doing super well with that right now, which is why things get worse. Because in the continued global failure to address problem number one, we arrive at problem number two, actually managing the consequences of climate change. When I hear climate scientists describe the disasters that will soon befall us, and they will, I lose my breath. It isn't just that climate change means more disasters more often. It's that this system, the one that many people expect will be there to help them, is not up for the job. Our emergency management system today isn't that much different from the one that I had a firsthand experience trying to navigate in New Orleans 17 years ago. This system is failing to meet our needs again and again, from Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico to the COVID response everywhere. And yet, there seems to be this implicit assumption, especially among politicians, that this same system is somehow going to step up and deal with this next wave of climate-related disasters. It's not. At least not in its current form. This is the part of our disaster movie where the scientist is telling you all that we've got a big problem, and the only way to stop it is to do X, Y, and Z. So here it is. Here's our X, Y, Z. We have to reform our emergency management system. We have to put more money towards prevention. We have to move people out of harm's way. We need to build differently. We need to actually create a system that accounts for our unequal risk. We also have to change how we're doing disaster preparedness. We can't just tell everybody to have an emergency kit at home and call it good. That's great, that's fine, you should all have one of those, but we need some big change here. I'm talking about an unprecedented investment into our emergency management system, and especially into our local emergency management agencies. I'm talking about actually supporting the work that the people and the groups who are on the ground during these disasters are doing. We also have to change how we're doing recovery. We have to account for these differences in impacts, and we need to build an approach that doesn't just double down on the systemic racism and classism that got us into the disaster in the first place. We have to build an emergency management system that prioritizes disaster prevention and provides more for the people who need it most. We can do this. We can build a more effective, a more efficient, and a just emergency management system, and we can do it right on time for some of the very worst impacts of climate change. A couple of weeks ago, I was back down south. I drove out to Houma and to Grand Isle and other parts of southeast Louisiana. It's been 7 months since Hurricane Ida, and in every town I went to, including New Orleans, there were blue tarps on people's roofs. Front yards had those mountainous piles of debris sitting next to the trailers that people are now living in. Southwest Louisiana looks about the same. The Louisiana coast is in imminent risk of disappearing. People's homes, their livelihoods, their culture, the history, it will be gone without immediate transformative action. That near future, that doesn't abide by borders. Every single state across this country, every single country around the world is experiencing the impacts of climate change. Right here in Cape Elizabeth, the water is rising. The Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of water its size anywhere in the world. That means higher sea levels, and it means warmer water to fuel the hurricanes that come further up the East Coast. Every disaster that you will experience in your lifetime has already begun. The decisions that create our future risk, they're being made right now. In Hollywood, disasters happen suddenly. In real life, disasters unfold slowly as national politicians bow to the interests of the fossil fuel industry and local politicians allow developers to build in high-risk places. In Hollywood, there's a hero who comes in at the last minute to save the day. In real life, the ones that have to do the savings, the one that have to be the heroes, that's us. Thank you.